Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack, World War II today, and I'm really excited. Alina, who have you got on?
So we've got with us Jonathan Trigg, who is a former military officer, historian and author. He's written books like The Defeat of the Luftwaffe, Voices of the Flemish Waffen-SS, and his most recent book, D-Day Through German Eyes, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you very much for having me. Really looking forward to speaking to you all.
Oh, this is going to be really good. It's been a while since we did something decent on sort of Western Europe in World War II, something battle-y. So let's just get stuck in with it. This is great. So obviously we know what's going on, and we've covered before what happens with us landing in France. But what's fate is the German army in? What are they expecting? They must know something's coming.
They definitely do. So they know the Allies are going to land in France in the summer of 1944. Everything points to that. The Allies themselves have made it perfectly clear. We were pretty much bogged down in Italy. Nothing much was happening there. So we're going to land in France. And, for the Germans, their issue was where? Because France has got almost as much coastline as we have in the UK. So the Germans did what they shouldn't have done, but understandably so, is they spread their jam all over the coastline. So they had troops on the southern French coastline around Marseille, all the way up the Bay of Biscay, Brittany, all through the Cherbourg Peninsula, and Normandy up the Pas de Calais. And in effect, they had to take some bets. They didn't have endless numbers of men, guns, and panzers, so they had to kind of pick where they thought the British, the Americans, and the Free French, the Canadians, where they were going to land. And they thought, go for the shortest angle. So put your best troops in the Pas de Calais. It's the shortest distance. You can see the White Cliffs from there. This is where they thought we were going to come across. They put their best troops there. Everyone else was pretty spread, thinly spread. But those troops themselves, even though they had, in Western Europe, they had about 850,000 men, 1,200 panzers and self-propelled guns, which is a lot. It's almost 1 in 3 of Germany's panzers at the time, and about 1 in 5 of its soldiers. But it was the quality that was lacking, not just the quantity. So, fascinating things such as I found out during the research for the book and so on was even watching, Saving Private Ryan, that horrendous opening scene and so on of Tom Hanks and the Americans coming ashore, on the beach, and at the end of it, after they lost so many men, you see a couple of the German soldiers stand up and try to surrender, and the Americans gun them down. But the interesting thing about that is that the Germans are speaking Czech.
Yeah.
So they're not speaking German, and that was actually true. So it wasn't just some extras who got it wrong, and it wasn't a miscue. It was the fact of the matter is that a lot of the German soldiers they had in the West, the divisions had been filled out with booty Germans. So ethnic Poles, ethnic Czechs, who'd more or less been told, right, as far as we're concerned, you're now Germans. Get in a German uniform. Here's a rifle, and stand on the west wall to face the invasion. And needless to say, not many of those guys and girls were interested in fighting and dying for Hitler. There was also a lot of full-blown Russians. So by this stage of the war, almost 1 in 10 of every German soldier on all fronts were Russians, usually former prisoners of war. Many of them who captured from the Red Army and faced either starvation starvation, death from disease and maltreatment in a German prisoner of war camp, or volunteer for the German army. And that's unsurprisingly what a lot of them did.
I have a friend, actually, his grandfather was Czech, ended up in France, so he's French. But he fought for the German army in World War II in the West. And when you say why, well, because he didn't have a choice.
And this was the thing. It's such a strange thing to think about that it wasn't just Germans who were there. And you always think, the propaganda photos of the time of these eagle-eyed, tall, blonde German soldiers, rifle over the shoulder, background of huge, big, beach guns, waiting to face the invasion. And it was a myth. And, it was an absolute myth. So many of the soldiers had been classed as medically unfit. prior to their call up in early 1944. Many when were wounded and injured from the Eastern Front, they lost toes and fingers and noses to frostbite and whatever, and were just retreads, and had been forced back into uniform to sit on the West Wall. And that doesn't detract. I mean, I don't want listeners to get the idea that they were all absolutely rubbish, and so there was never going to be any problem with the landings. That's not the case. But equally, it wouldn't be the truth to say that the German army in northern France in the summer of 1944 was the best fighting force that they had. It just simply wasn't. It was a very, very complex structure. And it even got to the point where there were Nazi officials in various, eastern areas and what have you, that would be, Polish or Czech or whatever, and they were racing, against their next door neighbour to show how many Germans, in inverted commas, were in their area. So they'd send their officials to a village to investigate the ethnic background of the population, with orders to, no matter what those people say, tell them they are ethnic Germans, whether they like it or not. And if they don't, we're going to deport them. But if they do, then they get to keep their house, their farm and whatever, and they can also, have a job and so on. So, I mean, it was just an incredibly challenging and vicious time for everyone involved, because, it wasn't a case of if you made a wrong decision, oh, well, never mind, it didn't really have an impact. It was if you made a wrong decision, then, yeah, as you said, the consequences could be utterly catastrophic.
So tell us about the beginning of the 6th of June, 1944. How do they experience the arrival? I mean, so there is at a point someone spots a massive invasion force heading their way.
But very much so. I mean, the invasion fleet itself was obviously the largest fleet of vessels ever assembled, and you'd think that they would have spotted it whilst it was out at sea. You couldn't lose this damn thing. And it would have either been, German ships or submarines or German aircraft would have spotted it, radioed it into the guys on the land and said, it's coming your way, get ready. But of course, but at that stage of the game, a German plane could barely get in the sky without being blown out of it by the Anglo-American air forces. And the seas were swept clean of German boats. And also, they just didn't expect it to come towards Normandy. They thought it would be, as I said, further to the north and so on, against the Pas de Calais. So they missed it. So literally in the sequence of the longest day, where the mist kind of disappears, and the German officers looking out of the bunker, and there's this massive armada right in front of him. To be honest, that's pretty truthful. That's how they saw it. It was German soldiers, privates, corporals, lieutenants, captains, junior officers, junior ranks, literally looking out to sea and seeing this armada just appear on the horizon. And pretty soon after that, they were in a world of pain. Because depending on what kind of invasion, what beach they were on and they were defending, they were either hit by aircraft first or by naval bombardment. And it didn't really make much difference either way. Because all they kind of perceived and understood was that a heck of a lot of high explosive and shrapnel was just bombarding them. And I can't imagine what that would have been like to be under it, because many of them weren't in, hugely reinforced concrete bunkers 20 feet underground and what have you. They were in trenches in sandy soil, with wooden bars holding the sand back, and just a few feet of earth if they were lucky. And it must have been just utterly horrendous to be under bombardment from wave after wave of aircraft, followed by battle cruisers, battleships, monitors, destroyers, you name it, just pounding every single position that the Allies thought contained a German soldier.
Presumably they react. So how do they? They're gonna say, right, we need to do this, and what do they do?
First thing they do is call for help and say, we're being invaded. It's here. They're here. No need to worry about where else it is and so on. It's here and it's happening now. And the reaction throughout the entire German command structure was, nah, it's all, yeah, are you sure? Are you sure it's them? No, I'm not. Take another look. Oh my God, I'm telling you now. Well, how many ships are there? There are literally thousands. There aren't that many ships in the world. Yeah, trust me, they are, and they're here. And it was just, they just didn't believe it. And
that's mad. Wait, so how does it
just
sink in then?
It's the craziness of human beings. And at the time, Hitler was asleep because he was, I mean, obviously a monster, goes without saying, but he also had a very, very strange working day. So he didn't get up till kind of, like midday type of thing. And then he'd start work. He'd mainly start work kind of, late afternoon. And then he'd work very, very late into the evening. And then, sit there with a load of cronies until 4 a.m, telling them what a genius he was. And then he'd go to bed.
Oh my God, that's like my working day under lockdown.
Exactly. He was in lockdown before lockdown. And so no one wanted to wake him up. So, I mean, you can imagine this comedy, happening almost outside his door, going, oh, the Allies, they're invading France. Finally, we've got to tell the Führer. And they said, no, but he's asleep. Oh, okay, that's a bit of a challenge. Do we knock on the door? Do we not? Oh, I don't know. Leave him in for an hour. Can you hear him? Is he awake? I mean, it's just utterly crazy. So they try to call for help and explain what's happening, and no one really believes them. Their ability to fight back at either the aircraft that are bombarding them or the ships is really limited, because all of the big guns that can fire out and hit a ship 10 miles or 50 miles out and so on, they're all in the part of Calais. Now, in Normandy, they've got artillery pieces, and these things can fire for a few miles at best and so on, but that's all. Everything else they've got just isn't big enough or powerful enough to hit the Allies. So in effect, they've just got to wait it out, and they've got to hunker down and wait until the landing craft come in, and then they've got a chance to hit back. And in the meantime, it's just a case of try and survive, and that's it, and just keep your weapon right next to you.
As a spectacle, that scene on Omaha Beach at the beginning of Saving Private Ryan is fantastic, but it's not quite as it was, is it? It's been made to look as bad as possible, but is it perhaps exaggerating the experience and the success that the Germans had when those waves started hitting the beach?
I mean, it is. They definitely dramatise it. You're absolutely right. I mean, and that's not decrying what those guys went through when they hit the beach. I can't, because of course what they don't perhaps cover, but because it's not very dramatic and it takes too long, is, and I always thought this when I was looking at it, I was younger, is that you get in the landing craft and the beach is just over there. It's like a few hundred meters. So you're in this landing craft for, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes tops, and then you're hitting the beach. But in reality, you're in that landing craft miles offshore. And you're looking at an hour and a half more before you hit the beach. So you're in this thing that isn't designed to be at sea very long and is rolling in the swell. Everyone is just throwing up left, right, and centre. You start to throw up in your helmet and then throwing outside, and then you're just throwing up on the floor. I can't imagine throw up in your helmet, emptying it, and then having to put your helmet back on your head. That's got to be a pretty bad day.
Yeah, it's not how you'd want to start, is it?
It's not. I mean, I know you've got to have helmet hair, but that's helmet puke hair, so that's got to be bad. But then, yes, when they hit it, the Germans were able to bring concentrated, particularly heavy machine gun fire on it, but the sheer mass of landing craft that they were facing mitigated against just too much destruction. There were too many Allies landing and too few defenders. And of course, those defenders just kept on. They were bringing down fire. And of course, as soon as they were doing that, the ships in close would be pinpointing, and they could pinpoint, individual machine guns almost, and silence them with a massive weight of cannon fire. But of course, it's still, if you're an infantryman, a ranger or an engineer getting off one of those landing craft, trying to cover 200-300 meters of beach without any cover against German MG-42s that are firing at a rate of 1,200 rounds a minute, that's pretty dramatic. And it does capture it very well, but it does make it look in the circumstances as though there were 20,000, 30,000 American casualties in the space of a few minutes, which of course there weren't. But it was just horrendous, and it was, of course, it was Omaha where the Germans had their best chance. Of actually not defeating the invasion, but throwing a massive spanner in the works.
Yeah, that end with the cliff is pretty horrific to be facing that coming off a landing craft, isn't it?
It is. I mean, and all the more when you go to the beaches now and you're on the bluffs above them, you're going, geez, this is actually quite high.
Mm.
This isn't like a sand dune at Lytham. And so on, 20 meters up, and then lo and behold, you're all fine. This thing is high. There's a lot of it, and there's hardly anywhere off the beach. The draws, as they're called, which is the kind of the cut throughs that they've made to be able to get off the beach. They're few and far between, and that just channels the troops. So all those soldiers are piling off their landing craft, and then they're being drawn like magnets to these draws to try and get off the beach. And of course, needless to say, that's where the Germans had concentrated their defensive positions.
Yeah, I see what you mean about it being their best chance of throwing a spanner in the works, because if you're a German and you're watching that massive force coming towards you, sitting up there or sitting in one of those concrete bunkers halfway up, you're going to feel pretty good about your chances of putting a stop to it, aren't you?
Well, this is the thing. And of course, it's the lack of communication from the beach, from the American troops back to the ships. Because of course that was, a real challenge for them, is all they're seeing is just endless firing. The Germans are still firing. So they're looking through the binoculars from the boats going, what the hell's going on? And they're just hearing, horrendous tales coming back, snatched radio messages going, we're not off the beach. We can't get off the beach. They're dead everywhere. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And, they really did seriously consider that right, that's it. Omaha's a lost cause. We're going to have to pull the troops off. And the Germans didn't know that, but for them, yeah, you're right. You're sitting in a bunker. You've got your machine gun. You've got boxes of ammo, and all you're seeing is guys piling off landing craft in front of you, and you're just pulling that trigger, and putting on the special gloves to change the barrel when it got too hot, and putting on a new barrel and loading more ammunition, firing, and you're just thinking, actually, this isn't bad. They're not getting off the beach. They're not getting towards us. We can hold this lot. And the German army was absolutely one that was built on the counterattack. So their idea was, no matter what happened, as soon as you were attacked, counterattack. And so those guys in the bunkers have been told, don't you worry, you just keep on killing them, and so on. And you're the other guys, they're coming behind you. The counterattack is coming, and so on, and it's going to arrive at the beach, and all you need to do is hold until they arrive. And then that's it, we've won.
Did you find any accounts by German soldiers on the ground that tell us what they thought about the face of it?
The accounts of the veterans that I spoke to and that I found and so on, all of them were just that they experienced it really viscerally. They were primarily young guys. There were some older ones and so on, but most of them were very young. A lot of them, it was their first taste of battle. So they didn't have the experience to fall back on, and it was the shock. It was the absolute shock of what they were facing, and then all of a sudden they're killing people, and they're killing people usually at quite a distance, and that's a very different sensation from killing someone up close. I've spoken to a lot of veterans who fought on the Russian front, and what they remember mainly is that close-up killing. So with an entrenching tool, with a bayonet, strangling the other guy to death, that sort of thing. It's where it really is close. Whereas for the guys that were there on D-Day, it was the vast majority of it was at a distance. It was hundreds of meters, and they couldn't see the people they were killing. They could see them as individuals, but they couldn't see their face, look into their eyes, or anything like that. And then just being overwhelmed by sheer firepower. That was the other thing that came through in all of the accounts I read and the conversations I had, was they would just they even those who were experienced and fought on the Russian front and thought, unsurprisingly, that they knew a hell of a lot about war, they were just overwhelmed. They couldn't believe what they were facing. Everything was of a scale and a size that just was their senses just couldn't take it in.
Yeah, it's like sensory overload, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And I can completely understand it, and so on. And it's just that in the phrase shock and awe, that a modern military machine, and the West always, the Anglo-Americans always, particularly the Americans, that was their credo. Their military credo was to use material to win the war, not use men.
Yeah.
It was just use weight of power, weight of explosive, and so on. So if they had to use 10 tons of explosive to kill one man, so be it. It didn't matter. It could fire as many artillery rounds, as many machine gun bullets, whatever. It did not matter. It was just overwhelm their senses and overwhelm them, rather than do it with human flesh.
So they do get off the beaches. Tell us how the Germans react to that. So they've been basically punched in the face with this overwhelmingly massive landing. How do they try and rally?
And on the day itself, they do try and follow through with that philosophy, that counterattack philosophy. So it was, they practiced it. They thought they were ready. So it was a case of, right, okay, after the initial shock of Christ, they're landing, and so on, right, everything into place. And on the Anglo-Canadian beaches, there was the only German Panzer division that was close enough really to the beaches to do anything, was the 21st Panzer. They went, righty-ho, go on, in the Panzers, start them up, and away we go. There's only one slight problem with that, was their commander was in a nightclub in Paris at the time, and so on, because he was a guy called Edgar Feutinger, who was not a Rommel. This guy was no Julius Caesar, that's for sure. And he liked a bit of the high life. So against orders, he used to sneak out of his headquarters of an evening with his driver, head into Paris, and pop the odd bottle of champagne and get some fizzy down him and see his mistress and generally have a good time. When he's then having to drive back, his entire division, as he's on his way back from Paris, is kind of leaderless, and they sit around waiting to go. By the time they actually get going, the Panzers themselves are under the command of a really fascinating guy who I wish I'd managed to interview before he passed, but he passed away in the 80s, way before I started to do this, obviously. And his name was a guy called Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski, which is a great name anyway. And he was an Olympic medal-winning equestrian from before the war, and he was dashing in his Black Panzer uniform. He had a Knight's Cross and all this type of thing. Very, very experienced guy, and he led the German Panzers on a counterattack. And he got to within literally a couple of miles of the beaches, and they were heading for a ridge line, and if they got to this ridge line, they'd be overlooking the Anglo-Canadian beaches, and they would be able to dive for them and really cause some chaos. And without knowing they were actually going to be there, a relatively small number of British troops had got forward, and they got to the top of the ridge, literally minutes. I mean, about half an hour or so, 30 minutes before the Germans did. And they stood their ground, beat back the German attack. The Germans, for some reason, didn't press their attack, which is quite surprising given their training.
Bizarre.
Yeah, and so they pulled back, and that was the end of the crisis. But of course, the fascinating thing about Oppeln-Bronikowski was that a year previous, well, more than a year previous, he was basically in reserve behind Stalingrad. And so he was in the command of a panzer regiment there as well. And of course, that was when the Russians broke through, and they were just about to surround them. And it was his panzers that were meant to drive forward and defeat them, and therefore would have averted the Stalingrad disaster. But his attack then fell apart. A lot of his panzers wouldn't actually start because, unbelievably, mice had actually eaten through the electric cables, so they couldn't start the things. And that's so you're looking at this guy. So how many times do you hear about one individual who was at two dramatic points in a conflict where he completely messed up on both occasions, and led to two stupendous Allied victories, one for the Soviets and one for us. I just find it incredible that the same guy was in both places at the same time. But and the other place where the Germans could have made a real difference was, as we said, on Omaha, and the guys there who were going to counterattack from the 352nd Infantry Division. They were loaded up with ammunition, and it was a case of, right, do we go forward? And their divisional commander was a guy called Dietrich Kreis, who was experienced, served on the Russian front, knew what he was doing, and his line was just under attack from all over the place. And looking at it, he got to a real decision point, so a crux point, and it was like, do I either use my men, the men I've got, to try and form a cohesive line with the divisions on my left and right, or do I launch them forward in an all or nothing attack to get to my guys who are still fighting on Omaha Beach, and take the chance and throw the Americans back into the sea. And militarily, the logic and the rationale was to do exactly what he did, which was, no, I'm not going to attack. I'm going to, form a line and concentrate my troops, to make sure I've got a cohesive force facing the opposition. But of course, actually, from a German point of view, it was totally the wrong thing to do. That was the point, and you might only have a pair of threes, but you've got to play them. You've got to play them because you've got no other choice. So he made that decision, and of course he didn't know that decision was going to be so important, and he took, in military terms, the right decision, but in terms of Germany's position at the time, completely the wrong one.
I have to ask, which beach were they the least successful on, the Germans? Where did they get really trashed?
Juneau was pretty bad. It's where the Canadians came across. They barely did anything on there. And Utah. So Utah, which was the other American beach, and that was because of the lie of the land. So when you go from Omaha, which has got the big cliffs and the bluffs, and you're a couple of 100 meters high, and the draws, the forcing soldiers into killing zones. On Utah, really, it was Lytham St. Anne's. So there's sand dunes that are 10 feet high. Kind of, if that, there's no good defensive positions. There weren't many German troops there anyway. The Allied tanks that were landing, the old swimming tanks, actually they got ashore there straight away and barely lost a tank again, which didn't happen at Omaha. So the infantry had tank support straight away, and they pretty much rolled over the Germans on Utah in no time at all. They just had nowhere to fight from. The casualties on Utah were very, very light.
I love some of these personal accounts that you've been telling us about. What is the single most your favourite German account you've used in this book?
Oh God! Now that
there must be one. I know you're going to be like, oh, but there's that one, and there's that one, and there's that one. And I know it's a horrible question, but which one did you see and just go, I am using that, and no one is going to stop me from including it?
I think for me, it was Janka on a young officer called Janka, who was on the Utah Beach, and for me, I absolutely love that because he was a Knight's Cross veteran from the Eastern Front, and so on. But he didn't look like anything. He wore big specs, and he was fairly short, and he was quite skinny. So he's not this kind of blonde Aryan Superman.
Yeah.
And he had a company of guys that he was in command of at Utah. The vast majority had no experience, or were medically unfit retreads. And he appeared and just thought, he looked around at his position, and it was like, what the hell am I going to do with this? I can't defend this. But he just did his best with the very little that he had. But then faced with the assault, he got half buried. under the sand from a shell blast. And he just, fought with a rifle, but was concussed. He didn't know where he was going. Most of his men were dead by that point. So it was just kind of him until literally he kind of almost woke up because concussion had really blasted him. And there was this American, with a typical kind of GI with his cigarette out the corner of his mouth, kind of saying that's it, for you, German, the war is over. And even then he was scrabbling for his rifle. So he's bleeding from shrapnel wounds, his eardrums have gone and all that type of thing. And he was scrambling for it. And this American just kicked the rifle away and said, "Don't be stupid, for God's." And it was just such a human moment. And so I thought that was incredible. And then, he was taken down to the beach side, to be put on board. And his own artillery opened up. And one of the group of prisoners he was with got injured by their own shrapnel. And he's like, "Oh my God, I've survived this thing, and I'm about to get blown up by my own side." And you're just thinking, this is the madness of war. And then he gets taken on board, one of the ships. So he goes back in an empty landing craft with a load of other prisoners, and they get aboard a ship. And of course, sailors are much like soldiers, and they steal everything they can lay their hands on. And of course, all the sailors are trying to grab all of his kit. Give us your medals and your ribbons and your bits and pieces and your watch and etc. And then one of them basically kicks him in the arse and knocks him over on the boat. That's just so real. I thought that was just an incredible, because there's this guy. He's not, he isn't this big dramatic player and so on. But he survived this, and it was over for him so quickly. I think, but at the same time, everything he went through, it was brilliant. I mean, it was absolutely fascinating to read that, because it was so real, and it kind of epitomised so much of the German resistance on that day.
Was there ever a moment on that day when they thought they were going to be able to beat this off?
I think none of the soldiers that I interviewed or read or got the accounts from thought that they were going to be able to. Once they'd seen what they were up against, none of them, all of them were just like survival. That's all we're thinking, just survive. None of them really thought that they were going to defeat this. Some of their commanders most definitely did. They weren't used to losing, and they, particularly those that served on the Russian front, they were used to being up against it. For a long time they'd been outnumbered and outgunned, and so on, and they didn't think that much of it. They thought, well, in the end it comes down to human beings, and we're better, and we can make a difference. And a lot of it was so much that they didn't think much of us. Particularly, they just did not think that the British. They thought the British were, they respected the British Army and the Navy and what have you. They thought that we were, dogged in defence and so on, but they didn't think much of our attack. Understandable. I can understand that point of view. They didn't think anything of the Americans at all. They really didn't. They thought of them very, very disparagingly.
Have they had a big showdown with the Americans yet? They haven't, have they? No.
I mean, none of that, because of course they fought them in North Africa, Tunisia, Kasserine Pass, and all that type of stuff. And of course they fought them in Italy, but in relatively small numbers. I.e., the German soldiers that had faced the Americans were few and far between, and many of them hadn't kind of rotated out, if you see what I mean, in terms of gone to other fronts. So if you were a veteran, German combat veteran in Normandy. On D-Day and so on, your experience was on the Russian front primarily. So you wouldn't have been in North Africa, and you wouldn't have been in Italy. So you hadn't come across the Americans. So what you had heard was, oh well, it's all about materiel. It's planes, trains, and automobiles. They've got endless bombs and shells and aircraft. That's the way they fight their wars. And as long as we stick it out, then we'll be fine. And they'd seen that in Italy. They'd seen, big invasions, but, the German army had managed to retreat. It hadn't got, massively smashed, and so on. And managed to hold them, month after month after month in Ity, which, of course, completely different situation in France, of course. with terrain, etc. But that's what they thought. So they hadn't really come across them, and they thought, yeah, we can take this lot.
Yeah. Was there a possibility of a counterattack by sea?
From the German side, most definitely not. I mean, the Kriegsmarine was, the Cinderella of the three armed services of Hitler's Germany. I mean, it really was. Germany had always been a land animal. Yeah. Anthony Eden always said it. It's an elephant facing a whale. When he compared, us to them, and he was absolutely right. Britain traditionally a sea power with a small army that was used to, fight colonial wars, etc. Mainly using local troops, but it was keeping over the sea lanes with the British Navy was the key. Whereas Germans, everything else really, it was about land, and that's what they thought. And the Kriegsmarine had tried before the war he had this thing called Plan Z, which was the idea was to almost do what they did before the First World War and build a navy to challenge the Royal Navy. But Hitler was never really going to go for it. And despite all of the threat of the submarines, he never really went for the U-boats either. So the numbers of U-boats being produced was tended to be in the dozens, per month rather than the hundreds, which is what they really needed. So by the time D-Day happened, no German naval vessel of any size, even a destroyer and what have you, let alone a cruiser or a battleship, would go anywhere near the English Channel, because it would be sunk on sight. And so they did have, they had some E-boats and some S-boats, in effect speedboats with torpedoes. They had a few. So on the day themselves, rather famously, a guy called Heinrich Hoffmann led an attack by a flotilla of these fast speedboats on the Armada, but it was pinpricks really. And again, same with the U-boats. To get there means most of their bases were down in the Bay of Biscay, so they were just told, well, you've got to try and make it. So they had to steam for speed. They had to steam on the surface, which made them huge targets for Allied aircraft. And they had to do it during daylight. And even if they all got to the invasion point, which of course they didn't, the sheer numbers mitigated against them. They would have had to sink 100 Allied ships apiece to even start to dent them. So the Germans just didn't have the only real threat to sea power that could have made the difference was air power. But of course, by then the Anglo-American air forces were huge.
Yeah.
And they were really good. I mean, they had great aircraft with pilots who had a lot of experience and a hell of a lot of flying hours. And they hugely outnumbered the Germans in the air. I would not want to be a German fighter pilot going up in the over the Normandy beaches at that time. That would have been akin to suicide.
I'm interested to know in how did the Germans experience the paratroopers jumping behind enemy lines? I mean, we know the whole Band of Brothers. We've all seen, the Americans jumping. But how did the Germans experience it all?
Yeah, I mean, for them, they knew, well, they thought that it was likely that the Allies were going to land paratroopers. So they'd done loads and loads of exercises about it. So the run up to it, that they flooded loads of water meadows by the sea and by canals and all sorts to stop gliders landing and so on. They put loads of obstacles in fields. So it might be, steel girders or just sharpened wooden stakes. I mean, all a bit Agincourt, but there you go. Just in fields to stop gliders coming down and for paratroopers to land on. And they've done constant exercises. So middle of the night, alarm, paratroop landing in this place, right? Get yourselves all together. Down we go for it and so on. And so they were ready for it, but even so, it took them by surprise. Because you can train for something, and we always did, but when it happens, for some reason you go, oh, that's a bit of a surprise. I don't really know why. It's something about the human psyche. So you can train, and then it happens, and you go, oh, I never saw that coming. And that's really because all of a sudden it's real. And for a lot of them, they're also thinking, because of the deception the Allies used. So, again, famously, they threw out dummies with parachutes, with firecrackers and fireworks and so on and so on. So a lot of the time the Germans were chasing their own tails. And they overestimated what paratroopers could do. Because the issue with a paratrooper is almost all paratroopers are volunteers. They're highly motivated. They're extremely well trained and very, very aggressive. Going to a pub in Colchester and you'll see that. But they're lightly armed. They're just lightly armed infantry. They can't carry tanks and artillery pieces and all this type of thing with them and a ton of ammo. They jump into battle with a rifle, a Tommy gun, and a few rounds and hand grenades. So a determined defence can actually really give them a problem. As Arnhem was the atypical example of that. Yeah. But for the Germans, it was all of a sudden they've got these guys falling around them, and then at the same time, or near enough the same time, the invasion's coming. So at first they're going, is this just a diversion? Where are these guys? And they're starting to see them coming through, but they're going, oh my God, there's a lot of them. Does this mean we're going to be invaded? And that came through in a lot of the accounts that when they were dealing with the paras, their minds were not on the paras. Their minds were, what does this actually mean? Does this mean we're about to get hit by the invasion proper? Because they knew the invasion wasn't going to come by air. It was going to come on, by sea. So it was like, does this mean, is this just a diversion? Are they throwing these paras out? Is it just a raid? Or does this mean in the next few minutes, hours, we're about to get hit by a cataclysm?
Your book doesn't actually stop with D-Day, does it? I mean, how far in the timeline do you go in your book?
It's a really good question. And what I wanted to do was cover really until the Germans lost France. And hence the subtitle for the book, How the Wehrmacht lost France, and that's, I wanted to cover it until the end of really the Falaise battle, when the Germans collapsed and then headlong retreat, which was end August, beginning September, with the majority of France then having been liberated, because the invasion Anvil had happened down in the south as well. So the Americans had landed on the French Riviera. And were charging up from the south of France to the German border, just north of Switzerland. And so I wanted to cover all of that, and really, because it is that, because there's this big focus on D-Day, and understandably so. But the fact of the matter is that it didn't end there. It was a hugely successful day, for the Allies. But the Germans still had their chances. They were still in the game. And the fighting then onwards was brutal, and it really turned into Normandy. It turned into a real grind, and a lot of it was again, it came through in so many of the veterans' testimonies. It was almost First World War-esque, and it was, you're fighting for hedgerows or for a hill or for a trench, and it was really, really close in. And just drained. And for the Anglo-Americans as well, it was their first real taste. And for most of the units that fought in Normandy, they hadn't seen combat elsewhere. They were green divisions.
Yeah.
It was their first real taste of combat against, eventually the Germans did start to bring in some of their best. And that's when the Allies, really, i.e. the frontline soldiers, really realised what they were up against, in terms of, if we're going to win the war, we're going to have to fight these guys every single inch of the way back into Germany, and that must have been horrific. I mean, you see some of the casualty reports from British units and American units. I mean, we had to constantly disband frontline regiments and even divisions in relatively short period of time, because they were burnt out. The casualties and the frontline companies in particular. So the casualties overall in a 15,000 strong division might not have been overly much. They might have been 2,500, but they were pretty much concentrated all in the frontline rifle platoons. So they were just gone. So you'd look around and you go, great, I've got artillery and I've got the supply guys and all the logistics, and they're all there, which is great. But who are they supplying? There's no one in the line because they're all gone. And you read reports such as Americans going, they've done reports saying, frontline soldiers, shouldn't be in the line for more than, kind of 30 days, and then they need rotating out. Otherwise they just, it's too much. And they went, yeah, we understand that, but we've got no choice. So we're going to keep them in the line. And they said at 90 days, the frontline infantrymen enter a vegetative state. And they said, well, there's nothing we can do. We've just got to keep them there. And, for the Germans, it was even worse because they had no concept of being rotated out. Once you were there until you were dead, or you'd won. And they weren't going to do that. So unfortunately for them, it was mainly the former and not the latter.
Have to ask you about your title. Is it a wee bit provocative? It's not the first book to have this title, and the last one, that book, there's been some controversy around the veracity of the sources, hasn't there? Did you choose it deliberately, and are you hoping that this is going to be like the new definitive work thanks to your level of detail?
I think, to be honest, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's Holger Eckert's work, which is D-Day through German eyes, and that's what obviously read it. Indeed, some of it, I have no issue with. And again, I read about the challenges to it and so on. And some of it,
the problem is some people think that they're not all real first-hand sources. Is that the issue?
Yes, that's the issue. And I can see that. I can, but having read them and kind of cross-referencing myself with other veterans, talking about the same beaches and the same units and so on. It has to be said, from my point of view, a lot of it rang true. There were some that I was dubious about, and I therefore chose not to use them. There was one account in his book of, it was an officer talking about, clearly, it was talking about an airburst weapon, a secret weapon system that was air fuel explosive. And it wasn't really explained in the book. But it was all hinting that this would change the balance of the war, and then for a whole series of reasons we didn't use it on the day. That to me, that was a huge question mark, because I read that and went, that doesn't ring true. For a whole range of reasons. One, when did the Germans, when did the Nazis have a weapon that they were afraid to use?
Yeah.
Yeah. When did they ever kind of pull back on moral grounds? No, we can't do that. That's a bit dodgy. They weren't known for that. And the fact is, the Germans never used any such weapon during the war. So it wasn't a case of they used it on other fronts. So therefore, there was the possibility that they had it. So yes, and when I read his work, if there was anything that I thought was untrue or just dubious, and I just couldn't cross-reference it and check it, then I didn't use it.
Yeah.
I mean,
you don't write a book to fight someone else's book. You have to put too much effort in. You have to have way too much energy and time on your hands to do that. But what you've done is create your own book, and yes, it has the same title, but it's the level of detail that's the real difference, isn't it?
And I didn't just want it to be here you go. Here is what Eckhurst did. Here's 7, 8, 9, 10. Full length veterans reports. So it's just a case of, right, chapter 1 is, soldier A talking, chapter 2, soldier B talking, and so on. He says that I wanted to put it in the context of everything that happened, on the day and in the campaign, and use really that soldier's experience to give some of the big picture and the strategy, but really then narrow it down to what was that soldier looking down a gun sight, or fighter pilot trying to avoid getting blasted out of the sky, or whatever it was, giving their viewpoint within what is the massiveness of war, because it's so. I always thought it myself when we used to go on even big live firing exercises, say in Canada as well. The fighting always seemed to, it was sort of simulated, of course, as exercise. It always seemed to be somewhere else, miles away. You could hear it just about, and you could see it, bits and pieces, but you couldn't really assess what was going on. And then all of a sudden it'd be on top of you, and you'd be in the middle of it for what would seem 5 minutes, and then it's gone somewhere else. And that's kind of eye level experience. That's what I wanted to get over.
It's really interesting what we're saying, in that you have these first-hand accounts, and perhaps accounts that maybe this guy used them and just didn't verify them well enough, because this is the thing with oral history, isn't it? You get that first layer where you can interview the people that were actually there and experienced this, but then do we have to wait till they're gone before we can approach it properly and analytically and sort of question anything they've given us?
Very much so. And of course it's you have to rely. I mean, what do the police say? It's if when they see a crime, if you've got an eyewitness, take whatever they say with a pinch of salt, because what a human being swears that they've seen might not actually be what they've seen, because at the time, particularly if the events that they are watching or involved in are massively stressful, dramatic, and so on, which of course combat most definitely is, then the mind does play tricks.
Yeah.
And you remember things, you're absolutely sure, yes, I remember that, that's exactly what I saw, that's exactly what happened. And then, it turns out that's not what you saw, and that's not what happened. But
it's not even you can't even say like they lied. It's not necessarily intentional, is it?
Exactly. And there's also there is that second layer. I mean, from Alex, from obviously a lot of the books that I've written in the past about Waffen SS veterans in particular, the majority of whom just served on the Russian front. And these guys, do I think that any of them were involved in mass murder? No, I don't. And so I got no evidence at all that they were. Do I think that at least some of them, shot prisoners, or suspected partisans and burnt villages down, all that type of thing? Yes, I'm pretty sure they did. Did any of them admit that? No, they don't. And they come out with there's almost a code that they use. So the language that they use. So they always turn around and say, oh yes, well of course we used to shoot terrorists, or saboteurs, that's terrorists, saboteurs, partisans is the other one. So
but then define one of those in the midst of war.
Absolutely, and then you try to kind of dig down, but again, you particularly when you're interviewing, face to face, you're doing it. They are only there voluntarily. They're not under pain of death to speak to you, and it's how far do you push the line, and where is that line? Because you need to ask difficult questions. Because if you don't, you're not doing your job as a historian. But at the same time, you've still got to elicit information. And you won't get anything from them if they just clam up.
Yeah.
If they go, no, you're gonna, you're just going to portray me as a Nazi and a murderer, so I'm not going to answer anything, and so on. So it's the ways and means of how you deal with it, how far you push an individual, and kind of peel back layers. And most of them, I'm absolutely sure, when having interviewed so many now, literally dozens and dozens of these guys, is that for many of them, they have it blanked out of their mind. So if they did do anything like that, if they did shoot, women, children, whatever, is they actually can't remember it, because they've convinced themselves over decades that it didn't happen, that they didn't do it, that of course it happened, but it wasn't them. It was somebody else. They never saw it. They never took part in it, and so on, even though some of the evidence might very well be to the contrary. They were in units that most definitely, did do, that sort of thing. And you can see it recorded in the unit diaries and all that sort of, and Wehrmacht reports and so on. So the paperwork's there, and they've got to have been involved in some way, but they just, it's not that they're not admitting to it per se, but it's the human mind just plays funny games. Particularly this far, and it's very rare as well that you get any of them that really are not honest, but still embrace what's going on. I interviewed one. It was a Danish Waffen-SS volunteer, and he was very elderly. He's passed away now, and he was in his care home, and he's there in his chair, and he started off by saying, "Oh, Mr. Trigg, I was a 100% Nazi, during the war." He goes, I'm not so much of a Nazi now. He goes, I'm just a bit of a Nazi. and I was like, and I was just sitting there going, well, this is a bit surreal. And then the first thing that kind of popped into my head was well, when you say just a bit of a Nazi, 10%, 20%, 25%, and also what does a 10% Nazi actually think? I don't mind killing a few innocent people, but only people named George or whatever. It's just it was just too random. And then I interviewed the guy for a couple of hours, and then at the end I was getting ready to leave, and he just said, "Oh yes," and then just flung up a Hitler salute. And I'm just kind of and he goes, "Oh, you British would never do that, would you?" And I'm like going, "No, we wouldn't." He said, "Oh, well, I just thought I would." And he was just it was so surreal. It's so surreal. But there's this guy living in this, liberal democracy, very, very advanced, Western state in Denmark, and thinks just, that's still okay, and he can do that, and it's perfectly normal in lots of ways. It's just
you get the reason that you don't get arrested and sent to jail for doing that, Mr. Waffen SS, is because you lost, right?
I just exactly. They just don't. They just. Oh, it is strange. It really is strange.
Wow.
But yeah, so yeah. I mean, it's. I always want readers or listeners to readers of the books and so on to make their own judgments about So I put down testimony and I checked it as far as I possibly can, but I wasn't there, standing or sitting next to this guy, when he supposedly did X, Y, or whatever. I put it in front of them. If I have any doubts about it, I never include it. But I want readers to make their own judgments, to say, oh, that sounds incredible, and then hopefully get them just interested. I mean, I think the best compliment of someone like myself can be paid is that I read your book and I was and it was really interesting, so I went and got some more. Even if they weren't mine, geez, even the other people's books, unbelievable. But if it twigs an interest in history that makes them go and read more, find out more, then I'm really pleased.
Because it leads me on to my last question. Is from a viewer or a listener. Ms. Walters says, Eric Axelson was a war historian who was known for being forthright. He said, when we are capturing war officially, we have to remember that the infantry's view is narrow and exaggerated. And she wants to know, from your personal experience as an infantry officer, is it fair, and how did you deal with that for the book?
It is, but I think I can totally understand what she said, because it's exaggerated really in a way, because it's incredibly personal. I have lots of friends who are gunnery officers, tank officers and so on, and I've seen the way that they operate, but it's completely different from the experience of literally holding a rifle and being there, and then understanding just how vulnerable you are. The first time I did my first tour in Northern Ireland, I stepped off a helicopter in the middle of East Tyrone somewhere, in the middle of beautiful, Northern Irish countryside. And I started to walk, and I was itching the back of my neck like it was going out of fashion, because I was sure, 100% sure, that I was in a sniper's sights at that moment. And I had no evidence for it. And there was, I had 6 other guys around me, and we were all walking, and no one was doing what I was doing. And there was nothing to indicate, but I was absolutely sure. And I was petrified. I was absolutely petrified. I'm walking along in this field, going over a fence, all this type of thing. And I'm thinking, any second, I'm not even going to hear the shot. I'm just going to be dead. And it was incredibly, and I thought, oh my God, I'm here for 6 months. If I don't get killed today, how the heck am I going to survive this? If it's going to be every single day that I do this. And and then after a while, literally, you go into, auto mode, and it happened really quickly. After about a week of being there, you were almost on autopilot. You felt as though you'd been there forever. And it's trying to get over that experience and what it's like, in a way that people is interesting to people. That's the challenge. And what I like about, for instance, looking at the Second World War is that you're doing that, talking to veterans who really, they've got nothing else left to lose.
Yeah.
In terms of, unfortunately, most of them are going to pass relatively. There's very few left now, and some because of age, and so they know that, and they've been able to reflect on their experiences, and have some real life experience after, because most of them didn't have much life experience before they had it, because they were all, mainly they were very young guys.
Yeah.
They've had that life experience, and they can really reflect on it about what it was, and put it in some sort of context, and they've got nothing to hide anymore, because they're, not to put too fine a point on it, they're going to die, might as well tell what they know. And it's, is it the same experience for soldiers from different kind of eras in a modern age? I mean, obviously it's different across different ages, but yeah, I'd say a lot of the time it is. But for them, because the type of warfare they had to endure was of a scale, and the weaponry involved, that we just don't, see today. So no modern British soldier, has waves of enemy aircraft coming over bombing them. Simple as that. Enemy does, that's for sure. Just ask the Iraqis, but the Brits don't, or the Americans don't. So you don't come under massive, artillery fire.
Yeah.
Well, the dangers that you're exposed to tends to be, the IED on the roadside in Afghan, or whatever, or the one that, am I just going to put my foot down, on this patch of ground, and I'm going to blow up a mine. It's a strange thing, and but at the same time, obviously British Army, all volunteers. I mean, I remember my now wife, we were engaged at the time. We'd moved we had our first little flat outside the barracks that we'd rented, and we were engaged to get married. And I was, sitting there on the sofa with her one night, and John Major was the Prime Minister, and they said, "Oh, we got an announcement from the PM," and he came outside number 10 and announced that my brigade was being sent to Bosnia for the war.
Yeah.
And I just leapt up from the sofa, just screaming in joy. I was going, yes, we're going. It's absolutely brilliant. I was so chuffed. I was over the moon. And then I kind of looked round, and I think it's fair to say Rachel's face was less pleased.
You paid for that leap, didn't you?
Oh my God, did I? And, but at the same time, I did it, because I just, and we all wanted to go. I mean, there's a reason. I mean, the horrendous wars that the guys have had to fight, guys and girls have had to fight in the last few years, in Iraq and Afghan and so on. And yet, we're not fighting any wars now in that sense, but we can't recruit soldiers. Why is that? And the fact of the matter is, because to be honest, there are certain individuals, and I include myself in that, who for some, we got screw loose and have got this thing as, actually we quite like the idea of going to war.
It's not new, is it? It's
definitely not.
You are not the only person with a screw loose. John,
no.
Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about this book. This sounds absolutely fascinating, and I like that we've discussed the difference between this book and the last book with the same name as well. Yes. I like that people now know why this is different and why they need to go out and buy it. So tell everybody again who's released it, when's it out, and where can they get it?
Right, so it's called D-Day Through German Eyes, How the Wehrmacht Lost France. It's by Amberley Publishing, and you can get it on either through Amberley Publishing, of course, or of course, where else does everyone go for books? Amazon. So it's out on Amazon, and it's in Waterstones, and all over the place. So go to the interweb, type into the what's Google and whatever, and put my name or put D-Day through German eyes, John Trigg, and it'll come up with loads and loads of options. Go and buy it. You'll hopefully really, really enjoy it. You can put it, put reviews on. And so on the best review that I've had so far was I can't remember the web address of this individual, but their review was, I bought this for a friend. They really liked it. I haven't read it, and they gave me 2 stars. Which I thought was brilliant.
Yeah.
I thought,
it's always great when you get the cover was bent 1 star. What? Yeah.
It did. I got on another book that I can't remember which book it was now. Is that the individual had ordered it from a website, and their review was, still haven't got it yet, 1 star.
Then why are you reviewing it if you haven't got it?
That was my thinking. It was I didn't actually deliver it to you, or rather I did not deliver it to you. So are you reviewing the book, or are you reviewing the delivery? But yeah, I love that one. I got it for a friend. They really liked it.
We collect those. Brilliant.
2 stars, genius. It's genius,
Love it. Everyone loves their cruddy 1 stars review. Apparently, we reduce history to stupidity on History Hack, and we wear that with pride. But the key is, it's D-Day Through German Eyes by John Trigg, Trigg, not the other guy.
That's the one. And thank you very, very much for having me on. I really enjoyed it. And so just great questions. And particularly that one about which one of the stories I've not been asked that before. And so, yeah, that was brilliant.
Brilliant.